In the year 1853, a man named Hormuzd Rassam was digging through the ruins of a palace in what is now northern Iraq, in a city that had been buried beneath a mound of earth for over 2,000 years. Rassam was an Assyrian scholar working under the direction of the British Museum. The site was Nineveh, once the largest city on earth, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, a place so powerful and so feared that the ancient world spoke of it the way later civilizations would speak of Rome. And then, in 612 years before the Common Era, it fell. The Medes and the Babylonians tore it down, burned what could be burned, and left the rest to be swallowed slowly by the desert. What Rassam found beneath the ruins of the palace of Ashurbanipal was a room that had been a library, not a library with shelves and bound volumes, a library of clay, thousands of tablets, each one pressed with rows of tiny wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform script, one of the oldest writing systems human beings ever developed. The tablets had been stacked in ordered rows. When the palace burned, the wooden shelves collapsed, and the tablets fell and broke and mixed together in the rubble. But the fire that destroyed the library also baked the clay harder than it had ever been, and so the words survived, buried, undisturbed beneath centuries of accumulated earth, waiting for someone to come and read them. Those tablets are now in the British Museum in London. Most of them are still there today, and on one of them, actually across several of them, fragments that scholars have spent generations piecing together, there is a story about two brothers, one who works the land, one who tends animals, a god who must choose between their offerings, a conflict between the two men, and an act of violence that ends with one of them dead and the other marked, changed, exiled from the world he had known. You recognize that story. Every person watching this right now has heard some version of it. Most of us encountered it as children. It is one of the oldest stories in the Western tradition, one of the first things the Bible tells us about what human beings are capable of when they are left alone with their jealousy and their grief. But here is the thing that changes everything. The tablets Rassam found in Nineveh are not the Bible. They were written in Akkadian, a Semitic language that predates biblical Hebrew. And the story they tell, while structurally similar to the one in Genesis, is different in ways that matter, ways that scholars have been quietly debating for over a century and a half. And the Akkadian version is not even the oldest one. Beneath the Akkadian tradition, there is a Sumerian layer. Tablets held today at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology and at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin contain a poem that scholars have dated to somewhere between 2000 and 1700 years before the Common Era. A poem about a shepherd and a farmer who compete for the attention of a goddess, a divine choice, a conflict between two ways of living, two offerings, a preference expressed from above that one of the men cannot accept. The structural bones of the story you know from Genesis are all there, but the Sumerian version ends differently. Not in death, not in exile, not in a mark placed on a wanderer's skin. It ends in something the biblical version never arrives at. It ends in reconciliation. The two rivals make peace. The farmer accepts the god's preference. The shepherd acknowledges the farmer's worth. They reach an understanding. Nobody dies. That ending has been sitting in the clay for 4,000 years, mostly unnoticed by the tradition that came after it. And the question of what happened between that ending and the one in Genesis, what was added, what was changed, what was deliberately written out and what was written in, and by whom, and when, and for what purpose is the question. This documentary is going to spend the next 2 hours trying to answer. This is not a documentary about whether the Bible is true or false. It is not an argument for any theological position, and it is not a dismissal of one. What it is a careful reading of the oldest written evidence we have, the physical tablets, the confirmed dates, the named scholars who spent their careers translating these texts placed alongside the story most of the Western world inherited, to ask a question that the evidence itself demands. What was this story before it became the story we know? And what do the differences reveal about the people who changed it? Before we go further into that question, if you've found your way to this channel, it means you're the kind of person who wants to go past the surface of things, past the version of history that gets handed to you, and into the layer underneath. That's what this channel is built for. If you're not subscribed yet, consider doing that and turning on the bell notification, not because it costs anything, but because this is a long journey, and the next time we go somewhere like this, you'll want to be there from the beginning. Now, back to the clay. There are 3 things worth holding in mind as we move through this story. The first is that the tablets are real. They exist. You can go to London or Philadelphia or Berlin and stand in front of them. They are not theories or interpretations. They are objects, ancient and silent, that have outlasted every empire that ever handled them. The second is that the story those tablets tell has never been fully absorbed into the popular understanding of where the Cain and Abel narrative came from. Most people who know the biblical version have never heard of Dumuzi and Enkidu. Most people who have heard of the Atrahasis epic do not know its relationship to the very first act of human violence in the book of Genesis. That gap between what the physical record contains and what the broader culture knows is the space this documentary is going to occupy. And the third is perhaps the most quietly unsettling of all. The version of the story that survived, the one written into the foundational text of 3 of the world's major religions, is not the oldest version. It is not the closest to whatever original kernel of human experience generated this narrative in the first place. It is a later version, a revised version, a version that made specific choices about what to include and what to leave out and what to transform into something the earlier tradition had never been. Those choices were made by human hands, and the clay remembers what the hands changed. There is a paradox buried in the ruins of Nineveh that nobody who studies ancient history can quite get past. The library survived because it burned. That sentence sounds wrong the first time you hear it, and then you sit with it for a moment and it becomes one of those facts about the ancient world that quietly reorganizes how you think about preservation and destruction and the strange ways that catastrophe sometimes protects the very things it intends to erase. Clay tablets, in their unfired state, are fragile. They crack, they dissolve in water, they crumble under pressure. Leave an unbaked clay tablet in a damp environment for a few centuries and it will return to the earth it came from, leaving no trace of the words pressed into its surface. The Assyrian scribes who maintained the library of Ashurbanipal understood this, which is why important documents were sometimes deliberately fired, baked in a kiln to make them harder, more permanent, more resistant to the ordinary violence of time. But most of the tablets in the royal library at Nineveh were not fired. They were stored in their softer state, stacked in ordered rows, on wooden shelves in a room within the palace complex, maintained by a professional scribal staff whose entire existence was organized around the collection, copying, and preservation of knowledge from across the ancient Near East. When the Medes and the Babylonians sacked Nineveh in 612 years before the Common Era, they burned the palace. And the fire that consumed the building baked every tablet in that room to a hardness that no kiln could have matched, because the temperature of a burning palace is considerably higher than the temperature of a pottery kiln, and the tablets sat in that heat for hours. The words pressed into those tablets by Assyrian scribes, some of them copies of text that were already 1,000 years old when they were copied, survived 2.5 millennia of burial in the rubble of a destroyed city, because the people who wanted to destroy everything accidentally preserved it instead. Hormuzd Rassam arrived at the site in 1853. He had been working in the region for several years under the direction of the British Museum, following up on earlier excavations by Austin Henry Layard, who had first identified the mound at Kuyunjik across the Tigris River from modern Mosul as the likely location of ancient Nineveh. Layard had found the palace. Rassam found the library. The tablets were transferred to London over the following years, arriving at the British Museum in thousands of pieces, many of them broken during the collapse, some of them fragmentary even before that, corners missing and surfaces worn where the original scribes had made corrections or where later readers had handled them. The work of sorting, identifying, and cataloguing what had arrived occupied museum staff for decades. And then, in 1872, a self-taught engraver named George Smith sat down with a fragment from the collection and began to read. Smith had no formal academic training. He had educated himself in cuneiform by spending his lunch breaks at the British Museum, studying the tablets, teaching himself to read a writing system that almost no living person on Earth understood at the time. By the time he was given access to the collection as a junior staff member, he had developed a reading ability that rivaled the most credentialed scholars of his generation. What he found on the tablet in front of him was a flood story, a boat, a god who warned a single righteous man. the destruction of the world by water, the survival of animals, the sending out of a bird to find dry land, the boat coming to rest on a mountain. Details so close to the story of Noah in Genesis that Smith, by all accounts, stood up from his desk, walked rapidly around the room, and reportedly began removing his clothing in a state of something between academic ecstasy and complete disbelief. The tablet he was reading was part of what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh, the 12th tablet of a longer narrative, containing the story of Utnapishtim, which is the Akkadian flood narrative that biblical scholars have spent the century and a half since Smith's discovery attempting to understand in relation to Genesis. What Smith had proven in that moment was something that the scholarly and religious establishment of Victorian England found deeply uncomfortable. The stories at the foundation of the Bible, the stories that European civilization had treated for over 1,000 years as unique divine revelation, had older relatives. They had cousins, ancestors, precursors in the literature of a civilization that had been buried beneath the Iraqi desert, and that the biblical tradition itself described as the enemy of God's people. The implications of that discovery have never fully settled. But the Akkadian tablets from Nineveh are only one part of the documentary record that concerns us here, because running parallel to the Akkadian tradition, written in a completely different language by a different civilization that predated the Assyrian Empire by over 1,000 years, there is a Sumerian layer. The Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago holds one of the most significant collections of Sumerian tablets in the world, assembled primarily from excavations at the site of Nippur, modern Nufar, in southern Iraq, conducted in multiple campaigns beginning in 1888. It was a religious and scribal center, the city where Sumerian literary tradition was preserved and transmitted across generations. What the Oriental Institute excavations recovered from Nippur was, in effect, the curriculum of the ancient Sumerian scribal schools, the texts that student scribes copied and recopied as part of their education, which is why so many copies of the same texts survive, each one slightly different, each one bearing the fingerprints of a student working carefully to reproduce words that had been old for centuries before they sat down to copy them. Samuel Noah Kramer spent most of his career at the University of Pennsylvania working with these Sumerian tablets. He was not the most publicly famous ancient Near Eastern scholar of the 20th century. That distinction probably belongs to others, but he was among the most methodical, and the work he published across decades of translation and analysis slowly revealed the extent to which Sumerian literature had provided the raw material for traditions that later civilizations claimed as their own original inheritance. Archaeologists have noted that the relationship between the Sumerian textual tradition and the later Akkadian and Hebrew traditions is not one of simple borrowing. It is more complex than that, more layered, more mediated by centuries of scribal transmission, in which texts were not merely copied, but interpreted, adapted, and occasionally transformed in ways that reflect the specific concerns of the culture doing the transmitting. What remains unexplained is the full extent of what was lost in the transitions between those traditions. The tablets we have are the ones that survived. The tablets that did not survive the intermediate texts, the variant versions, the experimental retellings that a scribe tried once and then set aside, those are gone, and their absence creates gaps in the transmission history that no amount of careful scholarship can fully bridge. The library of Ashurbanipal burned in 612 years before the Common Era. The tablets it contained are now distributed across institutions in London, Chicago, Philadelphia, Berlin, and Baghdad. The knowledge they encode has been partially recovered across a century and a half of scholarship, and the story they tell about the story we think we know is still being assembled, fragment by fragment, from the pieces that the fire left behind. The clay remembers more than it has yet been asked to say, and the most important question it has been asked, the question of where the first murder in human history actually came from, and what it looked like before the version we inherited, begins not with a brother standing in a field with blood on his hands, but with a shepherd and a farmer standing before a goddess, each one holding out what they had made, each one waiting to hear which of them the divine world preferred. That is where the real story starts. And right now, somewhere in the world, someone is sitting with that question for the first time. Someone is hearing it in the middle of a quiet night when the rest of the house has gone to sleep. Someone else is listening on a morning commute, watching the city move past the window. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are right now and what time it is there, because there is something that feels right about the fact that people in completely separate corners of the earth, separated by oceans and languages and time zones, are all sitting with the same 4,000-year-old question at this particular moment in their day. And if you are listening from somewhere that feels a long way from the ruins of Nineveh, we want to know, before there was Genesis, there was a goddess who could not make up her mind. Her name was Inanna. And the choice she faced, which of two men deserved her favor, is the oldest surviving version of the conflict that eventually became the story of Cain and Abel. Not a later retelling, not a loose parallel. The structural skeleton of the story, the bones underneath the biblical flesh, is here in this Sumerian poem, pressed into clay tablets that are now distributed between the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, dated by scholars to somewhere between 2,000 and 1,700 years before the Common Era. The poem has a name. Scholars call it the Courtship of Inanna, or sometimes more specifically, the Dumuzi Enkidu text, named after its two principal male figures. Dumuzi is a shepherd god, Enkidu is a farmer god, and Inanna, the most powerful goddess in the Sumerian pantheon, the deity of love and war and the planet Venus, the figure whose descent into the underworld generated one of the most haunting poems the ancient world ever produced, must choose between them. She initially favors Enkidu, the farmer. This is the first thing that stops you cold when you read the text carefully, because every instinct shaped by the biblical tradition tells you the opposite should be true. In Genesis, God's preference goes to the shepherd, Abel, and the rejection of the farmer, Cain, is the wound that festers into murder. But in the Sumerian original, the preference runs the other way. The goddess looks at the two men and reaches toward the one who works the soil. Dumuzi objects, loudly, specifically, and with what can only be described as a salesman's precision. He does not appeal to his personal qualities. He does not claim to be more virtuous or more devoted or more beloved by the divine world than his rival. Instead, he makes an economic argument. He lists what he has: milk and cream and wool and the soft cheese that forms when milk is left to separate in the cool of the morning, the abundance of the animal, the warmth of the fleece, the richness of the dairy products that a pastoral life generates and that a farming life cannot replicate. He is essentially presenting a competitive product portfolio to a goddess who has not yet fully committed to either option. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania working through the Sumerian literary corpus, translated and analyzed this poem across multiple publications spanning from the 1940s through the 1980s. What he found in the Dumuzi Enkidu text was not simply a love triangle, but a highly formalized literary genre, the Sumerian disputation poem, a form in which two figures, two animals, two seasons, or two professions argue their relative merits before a divine judge who renders a final verdict. The disputation poem was, in the ancient Sumerian scribal tradition, a teaching text. Students at the Adaba, the Sumerian scribal school, copied these poems as part of their education. The format taught argumentation, rhetoric, and the art of presenting comparative value claims. But the content of the poems also encoded something else, a cultural memory of real economic and social tensions between different ways of organizing human life on the land. The tension between pastoral nomadism and settled agriculture was not abstract in ancient Mesopotamia. It was the defining social conflict of the region for millennia. The two ways of life competed for the same land and the same water. They had different relationships to political authority, to property, to seasonal movement, to the accumulation and distribution of surplus. They looked at each other across the boundaries of fields and grazing territories with a mixture of economic envy and cultural suspicion that gets encoded over centuries into the literature that both traditions produce. The Dumuzi Enkidu poem encodes that tension in its most distilled form, two representatives of the two great productive traditions of the ancient Near East, standing before a divine arbiter, each one arguing that his way of life is more valuable. And then something happens that the biblical version never allows. Enkidu speaks. The farmer, the figure whose analogue in Genesis never gets a line of meaningful dialogue, whose interiority the biblical narrative leaves almost entirely unexplored, steps forward in the Sumerian poem and responds with his own list. The gifts of agriculture, the the grain and the lentils and the abundance of the cultivated field. And then, and this is the moment where the Sumerian poem parts company, most dramatically, from the tradition that descended from it, Enkidu does something else entirely. He tells Dumuzi that he bears him no ill will, that if the shepherd's flocks wander across his fields, he will not drive them out, that the grazing animals are welcome among his crops, that there is room, in his vision of the world, for both of them to exist alongside each other without conflict. Inanna chooses the shepherd. The divine preference, expressed through the goddess, goes to Dumuzi. The farmer does not receive what he wanted. His rival is elevated above him, and Enkidu accepts it. Without violence, without resentment powerful enough to override his basic decency toward another person, he reaches across the distance between their two ways of life and extends an offer of coexistence. The poem ends there. In an accord, in the ancient Sumerian literary tradition, the first version of this story, the version that preceded Genesis by somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years, ends not with blood in the field, but with two men who disagreed about everything finding a way to stand in the same landscape without destroying each other. One theory suggests that this ending was not merely literary, but ideological, that the Sumerian disputation tradition was specifically designed to model the resolution of conflict rather than its escalation, and that the Dumuzi Enkidu poem functioned in its original context as a kind of cultural instruction, teaching the student scribes who copied it that the correct response to divine preference favoring one's rival was acceptance and accommodation rather than rage. What remains unexplained is precisely when, and in which scribal tradition, the ending changed. Between the Sumerian reconciliation and the Genesis murder, there is a gap in the surviving record. The Akkadian intermediary texts the versions of this story that would have existed in the centuries between the Sumerian originals and the Hebrew redaction are fragmentary and incomplete. We have pieces. We do not have the full chain of transmission. Thorkild Jacobsen, a Danish-American scholar who spent much of his career at Harvard and the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, argued in his landmark 1976 work on Mesopotamian religion that the shift from the Sumerian divine world populated by gods who were essentially powerful humans, subject to the same desires and conflicts and economic pressures as their worshippers to the Hebrew conception of a single, transcendent moral God, required a corresponding shift in the narrative logic of the stories that both traditions shared. In a world with many gods, a divine preference for one offering over another is essentially an aesthetic or economic judgment. The god prefers dairy products. The preference is real, but it is not a moral verdict. Neither Dumuzi nor Enkidu is a better person than the other. They are representatives of different productive systems. The goddess simply finds one system more appealing than the other in this particular moment. In a world with one god, a god who is by definition perfectly just, whose every action is a moral statement, the same preference cannot be neutral. If God rejects Cain's offering, the rejection must mean something about Cain. It must be a judgment, not a preference. And if it is a judgment, then Cain's rage has a different quality than Enkidu's acceptance. Because Cain is not simply a man whose economic system was ranked below his brothers. He is a man who has been found wanting by the only moral authority in the universe. That is a different kind of wound. And from a different kind of wound, a different kind of story grows. The Sumerian tablets in Philadelphia and Berlin hold the version that did not need the murder, the version in which the conflict found its resolution before it found its victim. That version is 4,000 years old, pressed into clay by student scribes who were learning, among other things, that disagreement does not have to be fatal. It is a lesson the tradition that came after them found, for reasons we are still working to understand, impossible to keep. Genesis chapter 4, verse 5. 11 words in the original Hebrew. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard, no explanation, no criteria, no record of what specifically was wrong with the grain that Cain brought, or what was right about the lamb that Abel presented, or by what standard the divine evaluation was conducted. The text moves past the rejection as if it were self-evident, as if the audience reading it would naturally understand why a farming offering was found inferior to a pastoral one without being told. For 2,000 years, theologians filled that silence with moral reasoning. Cain's heart was impure. His offering was given grudgingly. He withheld his firstfruits, while Abel gave his best. The rejection was not about the offering, it was about the character of the man who made it. Augustine wrote about it. Origen wrote about it. The medieval commentators wrote about it at extraordinary length, constructing elaborate frameworks of spiritual interpretation around 11 words that provide no actual basis for any of their conclusions. What none of those commentators had access to was the 4,000-year-old economic context in which the story was originally embedded, the context that the tablets in Philadelphia and Berlin and London quietly preserve, and that changes the question entirely. The question is not why God found Cain morally deficient. The question is why. Across multiple ancient Near Eastern traditions spanning at least 2,000 years before the Hebrew redaction of Genesis, the divine world consistently preferred the shepherd over the farmer. Not sometimes, not in isolated texts, consistently, as a pattern, as a culturally encoded assumption so deeply embedded in the literary tradition of the ancient Near East that it appears in Sumerian disputation poems, in Akkadian royal mythology, in the symbolic structure of the earliest Mesopotamian religious calendars, and ultimately in the foundational narrative of 3 world religions. That pattern has an explanation, and the explanation is not theological, it is archaeological. The transition from nomadic pastoralism to settled agriculture, what scholars call the Neolithic transition, is one of the most thoroughly documented processes in the entire archaeological record of human prehistory. Sites across the Fertile Crescent preserve the physical evidence of this shift in extraordinary detail. At Tel Abu Huraira, in the Euphrates Valley of modern Syria, excavated by Andrew Moore of the Rochester Institute of Technology in the 1970s, before the site was flooded by the construction of the Tabqa Dam, archaeologists found a community that made the transition from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture in a period that can be measured in generations rather than millennia. The bone assemblages, the plant remains, the architectural sequence, all of it tells the story of a community negotiating the practical and social consequences of changing how it fed itself. At Ain Ghazal, in Jordan, one of the largest known Neolithic settlements in the ancient Near East, excavated by Gary Rolfson of Whitman College across multiple seasons beginning in the 1980s, the evidence includes extraordinary plaster statues among the oldest large-scale human figurative sculptures ever found alongside the agricultural and architectural infrastructure of a community in the process of becoming sedentary. The site grew rapidly and then declined, possibly due to the environmental pressure that intensive agriculture placed on the surrounding landscape. At Çatalhöyük in central Turkey, excavated first by James Melart in the 1960s, and then by Ian Hodder of Stanford University in a long-running project beginning in 1993, the evidence of the transition from mobile to settled life is preserved in the layout of the settlement itself. Houses built directly against each other, with no streets between them, access through holes in the roof, a spatial organization that reflects a community still negotiating the relationship between communal and individual space in the early centuries of settled life. What the archaeological evidence from all of these sites collectively shows is that the transition to agriculture was not simply a technological upgrade, it was a social transformation of the most fundamental kind, and it was not uniformly experienced as an improvement. Skeletal evidence from Neolithic agricultural communities shows higher rates of nutritional deficiency than in the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded them. The dental record shows increased rates of cavities from grain-based diets. The bones show the physical stress of repetitive agricultural labor. The populations grew larger, but the individuals within them were often, by measurable physical indicators, less healthy than their nomadic predecessors. Pastoral nomadic communities, by contrast, maintained a relationship to their environment that was mobile, flexible, and in many respects more resilient to the kind of localized environmental shocks, a drought, a flood, a disease affecting a specific crop that could be catastrophic for a settled farming community, entirely dependent on a fixed piece of land. A shepherd whose pasture dries up can move. A farmer whose field floods cannot. The ancient Near Eastern literary tradition preserved this comparison in its divine preferences. The gods, in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, consistently favor the pastoral way of life, not because shepherds are morally superior to farmers, but because, in the economic and ecological calculus of the ancient world, the shepherd's relationship to the land was perceived as more balanced, more sustainable, more in alignment with the rhythms of the natural world that the divine order was understood to govern. One theory suggests that the consistent divine preference for the shepherd in the ancient Near Eastern literary tradition is a direct encoding of the historical experience of communities that had made the transition to settled agriculture, and found it, in important respects, wanting a literary expression of the cultural memory that something had been lost in the exchange of nomadic freedom for agricultural surplus. Archaeologists have noted that the tension between pastoral and agricultural communities in ancient Mesopotamia was not merely symbolic, it was structural and chronic. The administrative records of the Ur-3 period, roughly 2100 to 20,000 years before the Common Era preserved in tablets at the Oriental Institute and the British Museum, include extensive documentation of legal disputes between herders and farmers over grazing rights, water access, and crop damage caused by wandering flocks. The legal system of ancient Sumer spent considerable energy trying to manage a conflict that the literary tradition mythologized as divine preference. In this context, the Genesis narrative takes on a different shape. When the Hebrew editors assembled the text that became the Book of Genesis, they were working within a tradition, the broader ancient Near Eastern literary tradition, in which the divine preference for the shepherd was an established cultural assumption. They did not invent the preference, they inherited it. But they also inherited an audience for whom that preference carried specific political weight. The early Hebrew tribal communities were pastoral nomads, their foundational identity narratives. Abraham leaving Mesopotamia with his flocks, Jacob the shepherd patriarch, Moses tending sheep in the wilderness before the burning bush, are organized around the figure of the herder as the favored one, the one closest to God, the one whose way of life most authentically expresses the relationship between the human and the divine that the Hebrew tradition valorized. One theory suggests that the Genesis editors retained the divine preference for the shepherd, not simply because they inherited it from the older Mesopotamian tradition, but because it aligned precisely with the political and cultural self-understanding of the community for whom they were writing. The preference was theologically convenient. Abel the shepherd is favored because the audience reading the story was a community of shepherds who needed to understand their own way of life as divinely sanctioned. What remains unexplained is the silence on both sides of the preference. The text does not explain why God preferred Abel's offering, but it also does not explain, and this is the detail that generations of readers have passed over too quickly, why God could not simply accept both offerings, why the preference had to exclude, why the divine relationship to human productivity was structured as a competition with a single winner rather than as an acknowledgement of the different and complementary ways that human communities sustain themselves. The Sumerian poem did not require an exclusion. Inanna chose the shepherd, but the farmer was not condemned. His offering was not rejected as worthless. He was simply not chosen, and he found a way to live with that. The Hebrew version made the choice total. The rejection of Cain's offering is not a ranking, it is a dismissal. And that dismissal, in a universe governed by a single, perfectly just God, cannot be morally neutral. It must mean something about Cain. It must be a verdict. And so the story that in its Sumerian form was about economic competition and divine preference became, in its Hebrew form, about something darker and more personal, about a man who was told, by the only authority that mattered, that what he had made was not enough. The grain lay on the altar. The smoke rose and then fell back, refused by whatever wind the text imagines carrying such things upward. And Cain stood in his field, the field he had tended, the soil he understood, the land that was the only world he knew, and felt the full weight of a rejection that nobody bothered to explain to him. 4,000 years of theological commentary has been trying to explain it on God's behalf ever since. The clay tablets suggest the explanation was economic all along, and that the murder was not inevitable. It was a choice made by editors who lived long after the shepherd and the farmer had laid down their original argument and, in the oldest version of the story we possess, found a way to share the land in peace. 11 words rejected an offering. 4 words changed everything that followed. The Lord put a mark. That is all the text says. Genesis chapter 4, verse 15. After the murder, after the exile, after Cain expresses fear that anyone who finds him will kill him, God responds with what appears to be an act of protection. A mark is placed. The mark will warn anyone who encounters Cain that killing him carries a 7-fold divine consequence. And then the narrative moves forward. and the mark is never described, never referenced again, never explained in any subsequent passage of the Hebrew Bible. 4 words. No physical description, no location on the body, no indication of whether it was visible or hidden, permanent or temporary, painful or painless, understood by those who saw it or mysterious to them. The most consequential physical marking in the entire first book of the Bible is rendered in the original Hebrew with a brevity that borders on deliberate concealment. And into that silence, across 2,000 years of interpretation, human beings poured everything they feared and everything they could not explain about the people around them. The history of what commentators did with those 4 words is, in itself, one of the most instructive case studies in the relationship between textual silence and cultural anxiety that the history of religious interpretation has produced. Because the mark of Cain did not acquire its most damaging interpretation through careful scholarship or sustained theological reasoning. It acquired it through the oldest and most persistent mechanism in the history of prejudice, the projection of existing fear onto an available textual blank space. The early interpretations were relatively contained in their strangeness. Certain ancient Jewish midrashic traditions suggested the mark was a letter of the divine name written on Cain's forehead, a direct visible sign of divine ownership, protecting the marked individual the way a seal protects a document. Other traditions proposed a horn, or a dog that accompanied Cain as a divine guardian, or a mark that caused the earth to tremble when those who intended violence approached him. These interpretations are fanciful by modern standards, but they share a common logic. They read the mark as protection, as the text actually describes it, rather than as punishment. The darker readings came later, and they came not from the ancient Near Eastern context in which the story was originally embedded, but from the social and political anxieties of medieval and early modern European communities, looking for divine sanction for hierarchies they had already decided to maintain. Beginning in the 17th century and accelerating through the 18th century in the context of the Atlantic slave trade, a cluster of interpretive traditions, drawing on an earlier but distinct misreading of the curse of Ham in Genesis chapter 9, began associating the mark of Cain with dark skin. The argument was not rigorous, it was not even internally consistent, but it did not need to be, because it was not an argument derived from the text. It was a conclusion derived from social practice, working backward to find a textual anchor. The Jewish Theological Seminary, along with virtually every credentialed biblical scholar working in the 20th and 21st centuries, has thoroughly and unequivocally rejected this interpretation. There is no basis for it in the Hebrew text, in the ancient Near Eastern parallel traditions, in the early Jewish or Christian commentaries, or in any serious reading of what the passage actually says. The association of the mark with race was an invention of a specific historical moment, serving the economic and political interests of that moment, and its damage persisted long after the scholarship that could refute it was available to anyone who chose to read it. That history matters here, not as a digression but as a demonstration of the central problem the mark of Cain presents, which is that the deliberate silence of the text is not neutral. Silence in a sacred text is not empty space, it is an invitation. And the nature of what fills it depends entirely on who is doing the reading and what they bring to the page. Now step back from the history of interpretation and return to the ancient Near Eastern context where the story was actually generated. The concept of a divine protective mark placed on an individual appears in Akkadian and Sumerian religious texts that predate Genesis. The British Museum holds tablets from the ancient Near Eastern collections, including material from the library of Ashurbanipal and from earlier Babylonian scribal traditions that reference what scholars translate as divine signs or marks, placed on individuals to indicate divine ownership, or protection. The function of these marks in the Akkadian context is consistently protective rather than punitive. They operate as visible signs that a particular person is under divine patronage, that to harm this person is to directly challenge the divine authority that marked them. This is precisely what the Genesis text describes. God marks Cain not to punish him but to protect him. The mark is a shield, not a brand. And in the ancient Near Eastern legal and religious context from which the narrative tradition emerged, that function would have been immediately legible to an audience familiar with the concept of divine protective marking. Archaeologists have noted that this reading of the mark as protective rather than punitive is supported by the specific legal parallel the passage invokes. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a diorite stele dating to approximately 1754 years before the Common Era, and held at the Louvre Museum in Paris since its discovery at Susa, Iran in 1901, contains provisions governing the treatment of individuals who have committed homicide under conditions that mitigate their culpability, provisions that prescribe exile rather than execution, and that include protections for the exiled individual against blood revenge by the victim's family. The laws of Ur-Nammu, held in tablet form at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, are even older, dating to approximately 2100 years before the Common Era, making them the oldest surviving law code in human history. They similarly contain provisions distinguishing between categories of homicide, with different legal consequences for different circumstances. In the ancient Near Eastern legal framework, Cain's situation maps onto a recognizable category: the killer who has committed an act that demands consequence, but whose circumstances complicate the application of the maximum penalty. Exile is the legal response, and the mark is the legal protection that makes exile survivable, the ancient equivalent of a document that prevents vigilante justice from overriding the formal legal verdict. One theory suggests that the Cain narrative was originally structured as a divine legal proceeding, that God functions in the passage not primarily as a moral judge, but as a legal magistrate applying the jurisprudential conventions of ancient Near East, with the mark functioning as a formal legal protection analogous to the provisions encoded in the law codes of the same cultural tradition. What remains unexplained, even within this legal framework, is the specific number attached to the protection: 7 times. If anyone kills Cain, they will suffer sevenfold. The number 7 carries enormous weight in ancient Near Eastern religious and legal tradition. It appears in Sumerian cosmological texts, in Akkadian incantation literature, in the structure of the Babylonian creation narrative, and throughout the Hebrew Bible, has a number of completeness and divine sanction. But the specific choice of sevenfold vengeance as the protective formula for Cain has not been traced to a precise parallel in the surviving ancient Near Eastern legal literature, and its exact significance within the passage remains an open question in biblical scholarship. It is also worth sitting with what the mark implies about the world Cain is being sent into. The text assumes that there are people out there who might kill him, people who are not his immediate family, who are not accounted for in the genealogy that the narrative has so far provided, who exist in sufficient numbers and with sufficient knowledge of what Cain has done to constitute a real threat to his survival. The mark is a response to a real danger in a populated world, and that populated world creates one of the most persistent and most quietly devastating internal contradictions in the entire Genesis narrative, a contradiction that later generations tried to explain away, and that the next section of this documentary will examine directly. But the mark itself, stripped of the centuries of interpretive accumulation that have almost buried it, is something considerably more human and more legally precise than the symbol of divine punishment it became in the popular imagination. It is, in the most literal reading the ancient Near Eastern context permits, a document, a small, wordless, permanent document pressed into or onto the skin of the first convicted killer in the biblical narrative, certifying that despite everything he had done, despite the weight of the crime that would follow his name through 4,000 years of religious and cultural history, he remained under the protection of the same divine authority that had rejected his offering. The rejection and the protection came from the same source. The same God who turned away from the grain on the altar turned toward the man standing in the field with his brother's blood on his hands and said, in the most concrete way available within the narrative, "You will not be destroyed." That is not a simple statement. It was not a simple statement when it was written, and the 4 words that encode it have been generating interpretations, arguments, and consequences that their author, whoever pressed those marks into clay or inked them onto parchment, could not possibly have anticipated. The silence around the mark was never empty. It was always full of everything the people reading it needed it to mean. Genesis does not pause. That is one of the things you notice when you read the 4th chapter carefully, with the ancient Near Eastern context in your mind, and the awareness that this text was assembled from older sources by editors working centuries after the events it describes. The narrative moves with the compressed efficiency of a tradition that has been told and retold so many times that its tellers stopped noticing the gaps. the places where two originally independent stories were joined together without the connecting tissue that would make the seam invisible. The most visible seam in the entire Cain narrative is 11 words long. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. Immediately after the mark, Cain walks into the land of Nod, and the text introduces a wife with the same casual confidence it uses to describe the weather, as if her existence requires no accounting, as if the reader already knows who she is and where she came from, and why no previous verse has mentioned her. She has no name in the Hebrew text. She has no origin story. She has no parents, no genealogy, no moment of introduction. She simply appears already present in the narrative, already known to Cain, already capable of bearing him a son, in a world that the preceding verses have populated with exactly 4 human beings: Adam, Eve, Cain, and the recently murdered Abel. The arithmetic does not work, and it has not worked for as long as people have been reading the text carefully enough to notice. The question of where Cain's wife came from is not a modern skeptic's invention designed to embarrass the faithful. It is one of the oldest documented puzzles in the entire history of biblical interpretation. The writer Origen addressed it in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Augustine of Hippo wrestled with it in the 4th and 5th centuries. The medieval Jewish commentator Rashi proposed that she was a twin sister, born alongside Cain or Abel, a solution that creates its own considerable difficulties. The English playwright Lord Byron, who wrote a dramatic poem about Cain in 1821, gave Cain's wife the name Ada and made her Cain's sister explicitly, which caused sufficient public outrage that the poem was widely condemned as immoral. The traditional answer that she must have been a sister, given that Adam and Eve were the only parents available, is the answer that requires the least adjustment to the surface of the text. It is also the answer that creates the most theological difficulty, because it requires accepting that the first human family was founded on incest as a matter of structural necessity, and that God either approved of or was indifferent to this arrangement. Ancient commentators were uncomfortable with this conclusion. Modern commentators are uncomfortable with it for different reasons, and the discomfort on both sides points to the same underlying problem. The text was not written to answer this question, because the tradition from which it was drawn did not consider the question relevant. This is where the documentary hypothesis becomes not merely an academic framework, but a genuinely illuminating tool for understanding what is actually happening in the passage. The documentary hypothesis developed across the 19th century by scholars including Karl Heinrich Graf and Julius Wellhausen, and elaborated by generations of biblical scholars at institutions including Harvard Divinity School, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the École biblique et archéologique française de Jérusalem, proposes that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, is not a unified composition authored by a single hand. It is a composite text, assembled by editors working over several centuries, drawing on at least 4 distinct source documents conventionally labeled J, E, D, and P, each one reflecting the concerns and assumptions of the specific community and historical moment that produced it. The seams in the text, the places where the narrative logic breaks down, where characters appear without introduction, where the same event is told twice with different details, where the moral framework shifts without explanation, are not scribal errors. They are editorial joints, the places where the compiler of the final text stitched together passages from sources that were originally independent of each other and that were not designed to be read as a continuous narrative. The wife of Cain is a seam. The source document from which the Cain narrative was drawn, most scholars working in the documentary tradition assign it to the J source, named for its characteristic use of the divine name. Yahweh assumed a world already populated with human beings, not because the J source author was unaware of the Adam and Eve creation narrative, but because the Cain story and the Adam and Eve story were originally independent traditions that circulated separately, each one internally coherent within its own assumptions, before an editor combined them into a single narrative sequence. In the Cain story's original context, the world already had people in it. Cain's fear of being killed by strangers makes sense in that world. His wife makes sense in that world. The city he builds makes sense in that world. You do not build a city for a population of 3. The story was never designed to be read as the literal next chapter after the expulsion from Eden. One theory suggests the original Cain narrative was not a story about the first human family at all, but a mythological account of the origin of a specific cultural conflict, the tension between pastoral nomads and settled farmers that was later incorporated into the linear genealogical framework of Genesis by editors who needed it to function as universal human history rather than as tribal memory. What remains unexplained is the editorial decision not to smooth the seam. The compilers of Genesis were sophisticated literary craftsmen. They were not working carelessly. When they joined the Cain narrative to the Adam and Eve narrative, creating the apparent impossibility of Cain's wife, they had options. They could have added a sentence explaining her origin. They could have restructured the genealogy to account for daughters born to Adam and Eve before the exile. They could have made the sister hypothesis explicit rather than leaving it to inference. They did none of these things. And the question of why they did not, whether the gap was genuinely overlooked, or considered too minor to address, or deliberately preserved as a space for interpretive tradition, is a question that the text itself refuses to answer. Archaeologists have noted that the world assumed by the Cain narrative is consistent with what the archaeological record tells us about the actual social landscape of the ancient Near East. In the period when pastoral and agricultural communities were negotiating their coexistence, that landscape was densely populated, socially complex, and full of communities whose origin traditions would not have fit neatly into a single genealogical line descending from one couple. The wife who appears in verse 17 without introduction is, in the most generous reading, a ghost from an older version of the story, a figure whose existence was perfectly natural and unremarkable in the tradition that originally told this tale, who became mysterious and troubling only when that tale was embedded in a narrative framework that had not been designed to accommodate her. She stepped in from another story, and the editors, for reasons we are still working to understand, let her stay. Her unnamed presence in the text has generated more theological argument than almost any other single figure in Genesis. She has been a sister, a pre-Adamic human, a daughter of a parallel creation, a symbol of the composite nature of the text itself. What she has never been, in over 2,000 years of interpretation, is explained. The silence around her is as old as the document that contains her, and as carefully maintained, and as full of the weight of everything the tradition was not quite ready to say out loud about where its own foundational story actually came from. Cain built a city. That sentence sits in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, immediately after the introduction of his unnamed wife, and it carries an internal contradiction so compressed that 2,000 years of readers have moved past it without fully registering what it says. A man has been sentenced to wander. The specific terms of his divine punishment, as the text articulates them just a few verses earlier, include the explicit condition that he will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. The Hebrew words are na and nad, restless and wandering, a condition of permanent rootlessness inscribed into the sentence itself. And then, within the same verse that introduces his wife, Cain builds a city and names it after his son. Wanderers do not build cities. Cities are the opposite of wandering. A city is the most complete possible expression of the human decision to stop moving, to commit to a place, to invest in permanent structures, to organize collective life around a fixed point on the landscape. The man sentenced to perpetual displacement becomes, within a single sentence, the founder of the first urban settlement in human history. The contradiction was not lost on ancient commentators. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian whose Antiquities of the Jews represents one of the earliest systematic attempts to reconcile biblical narrative with the standards of Greco-Roman historical writing, noted the tension explicitly and tried to resolve it by suggesting that Cain built the city as a refuge, a walled enclosure that could provide the protection that his wandering status denied him. The city as fortress, as answer to the vulnerability that the divine sentence had imposed. That is a reasonable harmonization. It does not dissolve the tension so much as redirect it, and it leaves untouched the deeper question, which is not about Cain's psychology, but about what the text is actually doing when it places the origin of urban civilization in the hands of the first murderer. The city is named Enoch. The land is called Nod, and neither place has ever been found. This is not, by itself, unusual in biblical geography. Many place names in the early chapters of Genesis correspond to locations that archaeology has not identified, either because they are purely literary constructs, or because the specific sites they refer to have not been excavated, or because the names themselves encoded meanings that their original audience would have recognized as thematic rather than geographical. The Hebrew word nod, as noted in the outline, derives from the same root as the word for wandering nad, which raises the possibility that the land of Nod is not a place, but a condition, not a geographical destination, but a description of the state of displacement itself. Cain goes to the land of wandering. He inhabits his own sentence. If that reading is correct, then the city built in the land of wandering carries a deliberately ironic charge. The first city in the world is founded by an exile in a land whose name means the impossibility of settling down. The urban project, in this reading, is Cain's defiance of his own condition. He was told to wander. He built walls instead. Now step outside the text and into the ground. The earliest confirmed urban settlements in the ancient Near East do not require any interpretive speculation. They exist. They have been excavated. Their dates are established by multiple independent methods, and they sit in the same geographical region, southern Mesopotamia, the floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that the Genesis narrative consistently uses as its implicit setting. Eridu is the oldest, modern Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq. The site was identified and excavated by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd for the Iraq Directorate General of Antiquities in excavation seasons conducted in the 1940s, with subsequent work by Iraqi archaeologists in later decades. The earliest occupation levels at Eridu date to approximately 5,500 years before the Common Era, making it, by current archaeological consensus, one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in human history. The Sumerians themselves considered Eridu to be the first city ever built. Their king list, a cuneiform document recording the sequence of ancient Mesopotamian rulers, copies of which are held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and the Oriental Institute in Chicago, begins with the statement that kingship descended from heaven and that it first alighted at Eridu. The first city, in the Sumerian tradition, was not built by a murderer. It was built by the first king under divine sanction. The Sumerian and Hebrew traditions are telling the same story. The story of how cities began with entirely different moral colorings. Uruk is the second major site, and in many respects the more archaeologically significant for understanding what urban civilization actually looked like in its earliest documented form. Modern Walker in southern Iraq, occupied from approximately 4,500 years before the Common Era onward, excavated by the German Archaeological Institute in campaigns beginning in 1912 and continuing with interruptions through the present, one of the longest-running archaeological projects in the history of the discipline. At its peak, around 3,200 years before the Common Era, Uruk was home to an estimated 40,000 to 80,000 people, making it by far the largest human settlement on Earth at the time. Uruk is where writing was invented. The earliest known written documents, clay tablets bearing pictographic records of grain allocations and livestock counts, were found at Uruk and date to approximately 3,300 years before the Common Era. The city that gave the world its first writing also gave it its most famous literary hero. Gilgamesh was, according to the Sumerian king list, the fifth king of Uruk. The city and the story are inseparable. Archaeologists have noted that the emergence of urban settlement at sites like Eridu and Uruk coincides closely with the period in which the literary traditions encoding the Cain Abel narrative were being developed and circulated. The scribal schools of ancient Sumer, the Aduba, the institutions where student scribes copied and transmitted the literary tradition, were themselves urban institutions. The stories were shaped by the city. The city shaped the stories that tried to explain where the city came from. One theory suggests that the placement of the first city's founding in the biography of Cain is a literary encoding of the actual historical process by which urban civilization emerged, that the Genesis narrative compressed the multi-century, multi-site, socially complex development of Mesopotamian urbanism into a single biographical act, using the figure of the exile and murderer as its founding agent, in a way that reflects the ambivalence that pastoral nomadic communities felt about the urban world that was increasingly dominating the landscape around them. Cities, in the experience of the early Hebrew pastoral tradition, were places of danger. They were the centers of imperial power: Babylon, Nineveh, later Egypt, that enslaved and displaced and absorbed smaller communities. The association of city building with Cain, the first killer, the first exile, the man bearing the mark of divine disfavor, encodes a cultural attitude toward urban civilization that was shared by many pastoral communities throughout the ancient Near East, and that persisted in the Hebrew prophetic tradition long after the Israelites had themselves become city dwellers. What remains unexplained is the specific literary function of naming the city after Cain's son rather than after Cain himself. Enoch, the name given to both the city and the son, appears elsewhere in Genesis as the name of a notably righteous figure in the line of Seth, the son born to Adam and Eve after the murder of Abel. 2 Enochs, one the namesake of the first city built by a murderer, the other described in Genesis as a man who walked with God and was taken directly to heaven without dying. The same name, 2 completely different moral trajectories, both embedded in the same text. One theory suggests that the 2 Enochs represent a deliberate editorial juxtaposition, that the compiler of Genesis placed the righteous Enoch of the Sethite line in conscious counterpoint to the urban Enoch of the Cainite line, encoding a theological statement about the 2 possible inheritances of human civilization. One line builds cities and culminates in the violence of Lamech. The other walks with God and is translated directly into the divine presence. The city of Nod has never been found. It was possibly never meant to be found, not as a geographical location with excavatable walls and datable foundations, but as an idea. The idea that civilization, in its urban form, began with an act of violence and was built by someone who had been told to wander and refused. That refusal, the decision to plant roots where the divine sentence demanded restlessness, is one of the most quietly resonant images in the entire Genesis narrative. Every city ever built is, in some reading of this text, a monument to the same defiance. The walls going up, the wandering refused, the name of a son inscribed over the gate of a place that, according to the terms of its founder's punishment, should not exist. 4 generations after the first murder, someone started singing. That is what Genesis chapter 4, verses 23 and 24 record a song. Not a prayer, not a confession, not a lament for the dead. A boast. The first piece of poetry in the Bible after the creation hymns is a man named Lamech, standing before his 2 wives and announcing, with what the Hebrew text renders in the compressed rhythmic structure of ancient verse, that he has killed a man for wounding him and a young man for striking him, and that if Cain's killer was to be punished 7 times, his own avenger would face 77 times that consequence. Biblical scholars have called this passage the Song of the Sword. Frank Moore Cross, of Harvard Divinity School, one of the most distinguished Semitic philologists of the 20th century, identified it as one of the oldest surviving fragments of Hebrew poetry, a piece of verse so archaic in its linguistic structure that it likely predates the prose narrative that now contains it, preserved as a fragment of an older oral tradition that was already ancient when the J-source author incorporated it into the Cain genealogy. The song is 9 verses long in English translation. In the original Hebrew, it is shorter, denser, built on the kind of parallel couplet structure that characterizes the oldest layer of ancient Near Eastern poetry, a form in which the second line restates and intensifies the first, driving the meaning forward through repetition with variation rather than through sequential narrative. It is, by every formal measure, a sophisticated piece of verse composition. Whoever shaped these lines understood the mechanics of ancient poetry deeply enough to produce something that has survived 4,000 years without losing its rhythmic force. And what that rhythmic force is in service of is the most casually terrifying thing in the entire 4th chapter of Genesis. Lamech is not confessing. He is not seeking forgiveness. He is not expressing regret about the man he killed or the young man who died for the lesser crime of injuring him. He is telling his wives, Ada and Zillah, the first named women in the Bible after Eve, that he is more dangerous than his ancestor Cain, that the divine protection extended to Cain was merely a fraction of the protection that surrounds him, and that anyone who imagines they can take vengeance on him for his violence is operating under a catastrophic misunderstanding of the consequences they face. The escalation from 7 to 77 is not incidental. It is the structural point of the poem. Cain killed once, and the punishment for killing him was 7-fold. Lamech has killed at least twice a man and a young man, possibly two separate incidents, possibly the same incident described from two angles in the parallel verse structure, and the punishment for touching him is 77 times as severe. Violence has not diminished across the generations. It has multiplied. The protection that was extended to a specific individual for a specific act has been claimed, without divine authorization, as a general principle of unlimited personal immunity. What Lamech is doing, in the literary architecture of Genesis chapter 4, is appropriating the divine. Lamech has extended that protection to himself, multiplied it by 11, and announced it to his household as settled fact, not as a divine grant, but as a personal assertion rooted in nothing except his own conviction that he is beyond accountability. The Atrahasis epic, the Akkadian flood narrative dating to approximately 1700 years before the Common Era, tablets held at the British Museum, provides the broader literary context for understanding what the Lamech passage is doing within the Genesis narrative structure. The Atrahasis epic frames the flood not as divine caprice or punishment for a specific sin, but as a response to the general condition of human existence that the Akkadian text describes as noise, a term that Tikva Frye-Mackenzie of University of Chicago analyzed in detail as encoding not merely sound, but the concept of social disorder, moral chaos, the accumulated weight of human violence and transgression that eventually becomes intolerable to the divine order. The genealogy of Cain that runs from Genesis chapter 4, verse 17 through verse 24, is a literary mechanism for generating that noise. 7 generations from Adam to Lamech in the Cainite line, each one moving further from the original relationship between humanity and the divine, culminating in a man who has effectively declared himself outside the moral order entirely, who has taken the symbol of divine mercy extended to his ancestor and transformed it into a manifesto of personal violence. One theory suggests that the Song of the Sword was deliberately placed at the end of the Cainite genealogy as a literary hinge, the moment that makes the flood narrative, which begins just 2 chapters later in Genesis, feel not merely inevitable but necessary. By the time Lamech finishes his song, the reader of the complete Genesis narrative is already prepared for the idea that the world has become a place requiring a reset. The noise has become unbearable. The escalation has reached its terminal point. What remains unexplained is the tonal anomaly that ancient commentators found so troubling, and that modern readers, approaching the text with the expectation of moral framework, tend to find disorienting. Nobody responds to Lamech's song, not his wives, who are present and addressed but given no lines, not the narrative voice, which neither condemns nor endorses what Lamech says, not God, who responded directly to Cain's murder with a voice from the earth, who placed the mark, who established the sevenfold protection, and who is entirely absent from the Lamech passage, offering no comment on the man who has just claimed divine protection for himself without asking. The silence is complete. The boast goes unanswered. And in a text that has been, up to this point, remarkably attentive to the moral consequences of violence, the ground crying out, the divine interrogation of Cain, the careful articulation of punishment and protection, the absence of any response to Lamech's escalation is deeply strange. Archaeologists have noted that the parallel Mesopotamian traditions do not share this silence. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about the divine response to human violence and disorder. The gods discuss it, debate it, and eventually act on it. The Hebrew text, by contrast, encodes the escalation without narrating the response, leaving the reader to infer from the flood narrative that follows what the divine reaction to Lamech's song ultimately was. The inference is not comforting. There is one additional dimension of the Lamech passage that the genealogical context makes visible. Lamech is introduced as the first polygamist in the biblical text, the first man to take 2 wives. Ancient commentators, including the author of the Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century before, the Common Era Jewish text that retells the Genesis narrative with extensive elaboration, treated this as a moral failing in itself, a departure from the monogamous model established by Adam and Eve. The polygamy and the violence are presented in the same passage, bracketing Lamech's character with 2 forms of transgression that, in the literary logic of the Cainite genealogy, belong together. The line from Cain to Lamech is a compressed history of civilization's first wrong turn. A murder becomes an exile, becomes a city, becomes a genealogy of craftsmen and musicians. The Cainite line produces the ancestors of those who work bronze and iron and play the lyre and the flute, all the markers of cultural sophistication, and at the end of all that cultural achievement stands a man singing a poem about how many times he will be avenged. Technology advanced. Music was invented. And somewhere in the middle of all that human creativity and productive energy, the moral distance from the original act of violence did not grow. It shrank, until the great-great-great-great-grandson of the first killer stood before his wives and sang, in the oldest surviving fragment of Hebrew verse, that he had made himself untouchable. The song ends. The chapter ends. 2 chapters later, the reign begins. The connection between those two facts is left, like so much else in this ancient text, to the silence between the lines. Before there were courtrooms, there was the earth itself. That is not a metaphor. In the legal and religious imagination of the ancient Near East, the ground beneath human feet was understood to be a witness, a sentient, responsive surface that registered what happened on it, retained the impression of violence, the way clay retains the impression of a stylus, and was capable of testifying to that violence before a divine authority whose jurisdiction was not limited by the absence of living witnesses. Genesis chapter 4, verse 10 carries this understanding in its most distilled literary form. God speaks to Cain after the murder, and the words used are not the words of a deity who has observed the crime from a distance. They are the words of a judge receiving testimony from a witness who has already spoken. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Present tense, active. The blood is not silent evidence. It is a living voice, still speaking, still filing its complaint with the only court that has jurisdiction over a crime committed in a world with no other human beings to serve as witnesses. The image is so vivid and so strange to modern ears that it tends to be read as pure poetry, as a striking metaphor for the impossibility of concealing violence from divine awareness. But in the ancient Near Eastern legal context from which the Genesis narrative emerged, it was considerably more precise than metaphor. It was a technical legal concept with documented parallels in the juridical literature of the same cultures that produced the Cain Abel story. The laws of Ur-Nammu are the oldest surviving law code in human history. The tablets that preserve them, held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, date to approximately 2100 years before the Common Era, making them older than the Code of Hammurabi by roughly 3.5 centuries. They were promulgated under Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, whose reign represented one of the high points of Sumerian administrative and literary culture. The laws govern a wide range of social interactions, property disputes, marriage and divorce, physical injury, and homicide. And they do so within a framework that explicitly invokes divine witness as a legal mechanism. In the Sumerian legal tradition, encoded in the Ur-Nammu Code and elaborated in subsequent Akkadian legal documents, oaths sworn before divine witnesses carried binding force, precisely because the divine witness was understood to be genuinely present, not symbolically invoked, but actually attending, actually registering the oath, actually capable of holding the oath-taker accountable in ways that human witnesses could not if they died or were bribed or were simply absent. The earth, as the ground on which all human activity occurred, was one of the most fundamental of these divine witnesses, omnipresent, incorruptible, perfectly attentive. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on its famous diorite stele, dating to approximately 1754 years before the Common Era, and held at the Louvre Museum in Paris since its discovery at Susa, Iran, in 1901, extends this framework into a more elaborated legal system. The stele itself is headed by an image of Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, the divine guarantor of justice, whose presence transforms the king's decrees from political impositions into cosmic obligations. The laws that follow are not merely royal edicts, they are divine testimony, inscribed in stone, witnessed by the sky and the earth and the sun god himself. Within this framework, blood crying from the ground is not poetry. It is a formal legal complaint lodged with the highest available court by the most reliable available witness, the earth that absorbed the blood and has been holding it ever since, waiting for the hearing that will finally discharge the obligation that violence creates. Archaeologists have noted that the specific language of Genesis 4, verse 10, the blood crying out, the ground as the medium through which the complaint is transmitted closely, parallels formulaic language found in Akkadian legal documents and ritual texts where the earth or specific sacred sites are invoked as witnesses to contracts, crimes, and oaths. This is not a case of the Genesis author reaching for a poetic image. It is a case of the Genesis author deploying a recognized legal formula that an audience familiar with ancient Near Eastern jurisprudence would have understood immediately as a technical invocation of divine testimony. One theory suggests that the entire structure of Genesis chapter 4, from the divine question, "Where is Abel your brother?" through the ground's testimony to the verdict of exile and the granting of protective marking maps onto the procedural structure of an ancient Near Eastern legal proceeding. God functions as the magistrate. The ground functions as the primary witness. Cain functions as the defendant. The questioning of the defendant, the receipt of testimony, the pronouncement of sentence, and the imposition of protective conditions on the convicted individual all follow a sequence recognizable in the legal literature of the same cultural tradition. What remains unexplained, and what the legal framework makes more rather than less puzzling, is the specific sentence Cain receives. The laws of Ur-Nammu prescribe the death penalty for homicide. The Code of Hammurabi Law, 163, in the standard numbering, prescribes death for intentional killing. The later Mosaic Law Code, within the same Hebrew biblical tradition that contains the Cain narrative, prescribes death for murder in Numbers chapter 35. The legal consensus of the ancient Near East, across multiple cultures and multiple centuries, was that intentional homicide was a capital offense. Cain is not executed, he is exiled. He is given a divine guarantee of survival so robust that it threatens anyone who attempts to take the justice that the law would otherwise prescribe. The most serious crime in the ancient Near Eastern legal tradition receives, in the case of the tradition's first convicted murderer, what amounts to a suspended sentence with a restraining order attached. The gap between the expected legal consequence and the actual divine response has generated interpretive work for 2,000 years. The theological explanations tend to cluster around divine mercy, the uniqueness of the situation, the impossibility of executing the only surviving son of the only human family. The legal explanations are more interesting. The laws of Ur-Nammu, despite prescribing death for homicide in the general case, also contain provisions that recognize mitigating circumstances conditions under which the standard penalty may be commuted or modified. Later Akkadian and Assyrian legal codes, including the Middle Assyrian laws held in tablet form at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, elaborate these mitigating conditions in considerable detail, including provisions for cases where the killing occurred in the context of a dispute that involved genuine grievance on both sides, or where the social relationship between killer and victim complicated the straightforward application of the capital penalty. The divine rejection of Cain's offering, the wound that preceded the murder, the provocation that the text presents without explanation functions, in the legal reading of the passage, as exactly this kind of mitigating condition. Cain killed from a specific wound, in a specific emotional state, against a specific background of grievance that the text acknowledges without resolving. The magistrate, weighing all of this, commutes the sentence, not because Cain deserves mercy in any simple sense, but because the law, even in its oldest documented forms, was capable of distinguishing between the act and its circumstances, between the crime and the conditions that produced it. The blood still cries from the ground. The testimony is still on record. The complaint has not been withdrawn simply because the sentence was commuted. That is perhaps the most legally precise detail in the entire passage, and the one that carries the most weight across the millennia of reading that followed. Justice, in the ancient Near Eastern framework, did not require the maximum penalty to be applied in every case. But the testimony of the earth, once given, could not be recalled. Abel's blood spoke. The ground transmitted the complaint. The court heard it and rendered a verdict that satisfied neither the standard legal prescription nor the modern reader's sense of proportionate consequence. And the voice from the ground has never, in 4,000 years of the tradition that preserved this story, been recorded as going silent. In December of 1945, a man named Muhammad Ali al-Samman was digging for fertilizer in the cliffs near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. The specific details of what happened next have been told in several different versions over the decades, since Al-Samman's own account shifted across multiple tellings, and the circumstances surrounding the discovery and the subsequent fate of the manuscripts involve enough competing interests and delayed disclosures that scholars have described the recovery history of the Nag Hammadi library as nearly as complicated as the texts themselves. What is not in dispute is the physical reality of what was found. Buried in a sealed ceramic jar, approximately a meter tall, were 13 leather-bound codices, books, in the most literal sense, not tablets, not scrolls, but bound volumes with pages, written in Coptic, the late form of the ancient Egyptian language that was the vernacular of Christian Egypt in the first centuries of the Common Era. The jar had been sealed and buried in the cliff face at some point in the 4th century, most likely around 360 years after the Common Era, a date that several scholars have connected to the edicts of the newly Christianized Roman Empire under Theodosius, which systematically outlawed non-orthodox religious texts and created the conditions under which a community possessing such texts might choose to hide them rather than surrender them to destruction. The texts sat in that jar for approximately 1600 years, undisturbed, buried beneath the Egyptian cliff. Waiting, they are now held at the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where they have been studied, translated, and argued over by scholars including Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, whose 1979 book, The Gnostic Gospels, brought the significance of the discovery to a general audience and remains one of the most important works of popular religious scholarship of the 20th century. The complete scholarly edition of the Nag Hammadi texts, the Coptic Gnostic Library, was published by a team coordinated through the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont Graduate University over several decades. What the codices contain is a body of religious literature representing a tradition of early Christianity, or more precisely, several related traditions loosely grouped under the label Gnostic, that the emerging Orthodox Church of the 2nd through 4th centuries actively sought to suppress, refute, and ultimately erase from the historical record. The heresiologists, the church fathers whose professional function was to identify and denounce heterodox belief, had described these traditions in hostile secondary literature for centuries. The Nag Hammadi discovery was the first time modern scholarship had direct access to the primary texts themselves rather than to the descriptions of their enemies. And among the traditions described in that hostile literature, traditions that the Nag Hammadi texts now allow us to read in something closer to their own voice, is one that inverts the Cain Abel narrative so completely that it reads, from the perspective of the canonical tradition, like a deliberate provocation. The ancient heresiological sources, including Irenaeus of Lyon writing in the 2nd century and Epiphanius of Salamis writing in the 4th, describe a group they call the Cainites, a sect within the broader Gnostic tradition that venerated figures whom the canonical scriptures condemned: Cain, Esau, the men of Sodom, Judas Iscariot. The defining logic of Cainite theology, as reported by its enemies, was a systematic inversion of the canonical moral hierarchy, the conviction that the God of the Hebrew Bible was not the highest divine being but a lesser, flawed, tyrannical demiurge whose judgments were spiritually inverted, so that the figures he condemned were actually the ones closest to the true divine light, and the figures he favoured were the ones most thoroughly captured by his limited and oppressive vision. In this framework, Cain's rejection by God is not evidence of his moral failure. It is evidence of his spiritual superiority. He belongs, the Cainite tradition argued, to a higher divine lineage, the lineage of the true God, the one above the demiurge, and the demiurge's hostility toward him is the hostility of a lesser power towards someone it cannot fully control. Abel, in this reading, is not the innocent victim. He is the favoured servant of a false god, the one whose submission to the demiurge's authority made him useful to that authority, and therefore the recipient of its approval. The murder is not a tragedy. It is a rebellion. One theory suggests that the Cainite tradition was not simply inverting the canonical narrative for the sake of transgression, but was preserving a genuinely older layer of interpretation, one in which Cain's position as the rejected one, the wanderer, aligned with the Gnostic experience of the pneumatic individual who exists at the margins of a world organized by powers hostile to true spiritual knowledge. The resonance between Cain's narrative situation and the Gnostic self-understanding as an alien consciousness in a fallen world was not accidental. It was structural. The Gospel of Judas, preserved in a manuscript known as the Codex Chacos, discovered in Egypt sometime in the 1970s, subjected to a complicated and somewhat troubled journey through the antiquities market before being acquired and conserved by the Maecenas Foundation for Ancient Art in Basel, Switzerland, and subsequently published, with the involvement of the National Geographic Society in 2006, reflects the same structural logic applied to a different biblical villain. Judas Iscariot, in the Gospel of Judas, is not the betrayer of a righteous man but the most enlightened of the disciples, the only one capable of understanding what Jesus actually wanted, the one entrusted with the most difficult and most spiritually significant task, precisely because of his superior comprehension. The parallel between the rehabilitation of Judas and the rehabilitation of Cain in the Gnostic tradition is not coincidental. Both figures occupy the same narrative position, the rejected one, the condemned one, the one whose relationship to the dominant divine authority of their respective stories is defined by a refusal or an act that the canonical tradition reads as the ultimate betrayal and the Gnostic tradition reads as the ultimate loyalty to a higher truth. Archaeologists have noted that the physical destruction of Gnostic texts by early Christian authorities was sufficiently thorough that the Nag Hammadi discovery represented a genuinely transformative event in the study of early impounding. Christianity not merely an addition to what was already known, but a fundamental expansion of the evidentiary base. The hostile descriptions provided by Irenaeus and Epiphanius had given scholars the outlines of these traditions, but outlines drawn by enemies cannot be trusted to preserve the inner logic of what they are describing. The primary texts allow something closer to an insider view. What remains unexplained is the full extent of what was destroyed. The 13 codices at Nag Hammadi represent what one community chose to bury and preserve. They do not represent the complete body of Gnostic literature that once existed. The texts described by the heresiologists that have no surviving primary manuscript counterpart, the Gospel of Eve, the Gospel of Perfection, the books of Geo referenced in other surviving texts existed once and do not exist now. Whatever they contained about figures like Cain, about the meaning of divine rejection and exile and the mark of divine protection, is lost in the same way that the intermediary Akkadian texts bridging the Sumerian and Hebrew traditions are lost present once in the physical world, absent now, their content inferable only from fragments and hostile summaries. The Cainite tradition, as described by its opponents, was declared heretical and pursued with the full institutional force of an emerging orthodoxy that understood, with considerable political clarity, that a tradition venerating the rejected and the condemned had the potential to undermine the moral hierarchy on which religious authority depended. If the one God condemned Cain, and Cain's condemnation was the signature of his spiritual superiority, then the one God's condemnation of any individual or community became not a verdict to be accepted, but a credential to be worn. That is a genuinely subversive reading. It is also, in the context of communities that experience themselves as persecuted minorities within a hostile imperial religious culture, a deeply human one, the need to find in the oldest stories of rejection and exile a framework that transforms marginalization into spiritual distinction rather than divine abandonment. The jar in the Egyptian cliff held that need preserved in leather and Coptic ink for 16 centuries. What it contained was not, in the end, a secret. It was a different answer to the same question that the canonical tradition had been answering since the story was first pressed into clay. What does it mean to be the one God turned away from? The orthodox answer: it means you failed. The answer in the buried jar: it means you were free. 3 traditions, 3 languages, 3,000 years of transmission. And at the end of all that distance, the distance between the student scribe in a Sumerian Aduba pressing a stylus into wet clay around 1900 years before the Common Era, and the Hebrew editors assembling the final form of Genesis, somewhere in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era. What survives is a story that most of the world recognizes, and almost nobody has read in its full context. The exercise of placing the 3 textual traditions alongside each other, not to rank them, not to argue for the priority of one over the others, but simply to read them as a sequence and notice what each one contains that the others do not, is one of the most clarifying things you can do with this material. It does not resolve the theological questions the narrative raises. It does not explain the divine preference or justify the murder or account for the unnamed wife or locate the city of Nod. What it does is reveal the shape of the editorial choices, the places where the tradition accumulated something new, and the places where it lost something old, and the pattern that those accumulations and losses trace across 3 millennia of human storytelling. Start with what the Sumerian tradition has. The Dumuzi Enkidu text, held in fragments at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, gives us 2 named figures of roughly equal standing, a shepherd god and a farmer god, both capable of speech, both capable of argument, both capable of loss and acceptance. It gives us a divine arbiter whose preference, while final, is not framed as a moral verdict. It gives us an economic logic for the preference. The shepherd's products are listed, the farmer's products are listed, and the comparison is conducted openly as a legitimate competition between 2 valid productive systems. And it gives us an ending that the entire subsequent tradition abandons: reconciliation. The farmer accepts the preference. The shepherd acknowledges the farmer's worth. The conflict finds its resolution before it finds its victim. What the Sumerian tradition does not have is a murder. It does not have an exile. It does not have a mark, a genealogy, a city built in a land of wandering, a song of unlimited vengeance, or a connection to a flood narrative that resets the human world. These elements are absent not because the Sumerian tradition was incomplete, but because it was complete in its own terms. It was telling a different story about the same conflict, a story in which the conflict was the point, and its resolution was the conclusion. Now place the Akkadian layer alongside it. The Akkadian material is more fragmentary in its relationship to the specific Cain Abel narrative. There is no surviving Akkadian text that is a direct parallel to Genesis chapter 4, in the way that the Dumuzi Enkidu text parallels the structural setup of the conflict. What the Akkadian tradition contributes is the connective tissue, the legal vocabulary, the theological framework, the flood narrative that gives the escalating genealogy its ultimate consequence. The Atrahasis epic, dated to approximately 1700 years before the Common Era and preserved in tablets held at the British Museum, provides the framework within which human violence and the divine response to it acquire their cosmic significance. The concept of blood guilt, the earth as witness, the ground as the medium through which the complaint of the dead reaches the divine court, is embedded in Akkadian legal and ritual literature in a way that illuminates the Genesis passage with a precision that purely literary analysis cannot achieve. The Akkadian tradition is the bridge, the cultural and linguistic layer through which the Sumerian material was transmitted and transformed before it reached the Hebrew editors who produced the final text. What the Akkadian tradition adds to what the Sumerian tradition had is the moral weight of divine preference. In the Sumerian context, the goddess prefers the shepherd the way a consumer might prefer one product over another. It is a real preference with real consequences, but it is not a verdict on the farmer's character. In the Akkadian religious tradition, as that tradition evolved toward a more elaborated theology of divine justice, preference begins to acquire the quality of judgment. The gods do not simply prefer, they discern, and what they discern in the one they reject is the condition that produced the rejection, a condition that, in the fully developed Hebrew version of the theology, becomes moral rather than merely practical. The Hebrew tradition, the final layer, completes the transformation. What Genesis adds to what the Akkadian tradition had already added to the Sumerian foundation is moral interiority. For the first time in the sequence, we are inside Cain's mind. Genesis chapter 4, verse 5. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And verse 6. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen?" The divine interrogation before the murder is unique to the Hebrew version. God sees Cain's emotional state and addresses it directly, asking a question that implies the possibility of a different outcome, that the anger is visible, that it is legible, that it does not have to resolve into violence. Cain does not respond to the question. The text moves forward without recording his answer, which is itself one of the most significant silences in the entire narrative. The moment when the possibility of a different story was present and was not taken. That silence does not exist in the Sumerian version because the Sumerian version does not require it. Enkidu, presented with divine rejection, does not burn with an anger that needs to be addressed and redirected. He accepts. In the Hebrew version, acceptance was available as an option. God explicitly offers it, and Cain does not take it. The murder is therefore, in the Hebrew moral framework, not simply a consequence of divine rejection, but a failure of the will, a choice made in the space between the anger and the act, a space that the divine question tried to open and that Cain closed. One theory suggests that the insertion of the divine question before the murder, unique to the Hebrew text, represents the most significant single editorial addition to the entire Cain tradition, because it transforms what was in the Sumerian original, a conflict with no moral agent, into a story with a protagonist who had the opportunity to choose differently and chose wrongly. The theological implications of that transformation are enormous. The Sumerian version is a story about the conditions of human conflict. The Hebrew version is a story about human freedom and its misuse. What the Hebrew tradition loses in making that transformation is the Sumerian version's sense of the farmer as a full human being with a legitimate claim on the divine world. Cain, in Genesis, does not get to make Enkidu's argument. He does not stand before God and list what agriculture produces, what the cultivated field offers, what the farmer's relationship to the earth contains that the shepherd's relationship cannot replicate. His offering is rejected, and the text provides no record of his attempt to understand why or to make the case for its value. Archaeologists have noted that the comparative reading of the three traditions reveals a consistent pattern of reduction in the complexity of the non-chosen figure. The Sumerian Enkidu is articulate, dignified, and capable of generosity. The Hebrew Cain is emotionally volatile, morally responsible for the violence he commits, and entirely without the self-awareness that might have led him to accept what he could not change. The figure who, in the oldest version of the story, demonstrated the highest moral capacity, the capacity to accept loss with grace, becomes, in the latest version, the figure whose inability to accept loss produces the founding act of human violence. What remains unexplained is whether that transformation was a loss or a gain. The Sumerian version is more generous to Cain, more balanced in its treatment of the two ways of life, more honest about the economic nature of the conflict, but it does not produce a story with the capacity to function as a universal statement about human moral failure. A story that every reader, regardless of whether they are a shepherd or a farmer, can recognize as being about the worst thing they are capable of. The Hebrew version is harder on Cain. It closes off the sympathy that the Sumerian version preserved, but it opens up something the Sumerian version never attempted: the possibility that the story is not about the conflict between two ways of living on the land, but about the conflict within a single human consciousness between the capacity for acceptance and the capacity for destruction. William F. Albright of Johns Hopkins University, whose William F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem has contributed generations of scholarship to the comparative study of ancient Near Eastern and biblical texts, argued across his career that the Hebrew tradition did not merely inherit its sources, it transformed them in ways that reflected a genuinely new theological and moral vision. The transformation of the Sumerian reconciliation into the Hebrew murder was not, in Albright's reading, a degradation of the material. It was a deepening of it, a willingness to look at the worst of human possibility and name it clearly, rather than dissolving it into a harmonious ending. The tablets know the older story, the more generous story, the story in which the farmer found a way to live with his loss. The Bible remembered something different. It remembered the rage that the farmer could not set down, the offering that remained on the altar, refused, the field where the argument ended in blood. Both versions are true to something. The question of which truth matters more is one that 4,000 years of reading has not resolved, and the clay, patient and silent beneath the museums of Philadelphia and Berlin and London, continues to hold the older answer, the one in which the two men, despite everything, found a way to share the land. We began with a jar, not the gazelle skin map in Istanbul that opened the previous documentary. Something older, more intimate, more fragile. A ceramic jar buried in an Egyptian cliff face sometime in the 4th century of the Common Era, sealed by hands that understood they were preserving something the world around them had decided to destroy. That jar held 13 leather-bound books. Those books held, among many other things, a tradition in which the first murderer in the Bible was not a villain but a man who had been turned away by a false god and found, in that rejection, a kind of liberation. That jar survived 1600 years in the dark. The clay tablets in Philadelphia and Berlin and London survived 4,000 years in the ground. The diorite stele bearing the Code of Hammurabi survived 3,700 years, used at some point as a trophy of conquest, its surface partially erased, carried from Babylon to Susa, where French archaeologists found it in 1901, and brought it to Paris, where it stands today in the Louvre. The laws still legible, still describing a world in which blood guilt is real, and the earth is a witness, and the sentence for violence can be commuted, but not erased. Everything that matters about this story survived because it was buried, because it was hidden, because the people who held it understood that the surface of the world is not safe for things that are true in ways the surface of the world finds uncomfortable, and so they put those things into the earth and trusted the earth to hold them until the moment was right to bring them back up. That is the pattern this documentary has been tracing across 12 sections and 4,000 years of evidence. Not a conspiracy, not a suppression coordinated by a single authority with a single agenda. Something more diffuse and more human, the ordinary tendency of any dominant tradition, to simplify the stories it inherits, to reduce the complexity that makes those stories difficult to use as instruments of social cohesion, and to lose. In that reduction, the layers that told a different, and in some respects more honest account of what the original conflict was actually about. What the tablets restored, once scholars began reading them seriously in the decades after Hormuzd-Rassam's excavations in Nineveh in 1853, was not merely additional information about the Cain Abel story. It was the context that makes the story legible as something other than a simple moral fable about the consequences of envy and violence. The Sumerian and Akkadian material revealed that the conflict between Cain and Abel was not invented to illustrate a moral principle. It was inherited from a much older tradition in which the conflict was the subject, in which the tension between two ways of living on the land was the actual content of the story, and the question of which way was divinely preferred was a genuine social and economic question that real communities were negotiating in real time. The farmer and the shepherd are not symbols. They are the representatives of the two most significant productive systems that human civilization has ever developed, and the conflict between them over land use, water rights, the right to enclose and the right to move freely, the competing claims of the cultivated and the pastoral on the shared surface of the earth, is not a conflict that ended when the biblical canon was assembled. It is a conflict that continued through the enclosure movements of medieval Europe, through the displacement of nomadic and pastoral communities, by agricultural expansion on every inhabited continent, through the range wars of the 19th century American West, through the ongoing dispossession of indigenous pastoral communities in Africa and Central Asia and the Americas by the legal and administrative apparatus of settled agricultural states. The first story the ancient world told about human conflict was this story, not because the people who first told it understood it as a universal statement about the human condition, but because it was the conflict most immediately present in their experience, the boundary between the field and the grazing land, the question of who had the prior claim, the wound of being told by the highest available authority that what you had made was not enough. That wound is still open. It has never closed. It has been redressed in different vocabularies across 4,000 years. Theological, legal, economic, political, but beneath every vocabulary the same basic injury persists. The work of your hands was evaluated and found insufficient. The way of life you inherited and maintained was ranked below another. The divine preference, whatever form it takes in the specific historical moment, went to someone else. Cain's response to that injury was the wrong one. The Hebrew tradition is clear about that. And the clarity is one of the things the tradition genuinely contributes over and above what the Sumerian version offered. Enkidu's acceptance is admirable, but it does not tell us what to do with the injury that acceptance failed, to prevent the injury that persists even after the graceful response, the wound that heals on the surface and continues to ache in the tissue beneath. Genesis does not tell us that either. It tells us what happened when the injury was not accepted and the ache was not acknowledged, and the anger found the nearest available target. It tells us the worst outcome, and it leaves the space between the divine question, "Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen?" and the murder unfilled. Because the tradition understood, at whatever depth traditions understand things, that the space between those two moments is the space where human freedom lives, and human choice is made, and human history turns on the fulcrum of what one person decides to do with what they cannot change. The interpretive responsibility that the full history of this text imposes on anyone who has followed it this far is not a comfortable one. The mark of Cain was used for centuries to justify the enslavement of human beings. The silence in the text about the mark's nature was filled with the specific fear and greed of specific historical communities, and the filling produced consequences that outlasted the communities themselves by generations. That did not happen because the text demanded that reading. It happened because the silence was available, and certain readers brought to that silence exactly what they needed to find there. Every silence, in every sacred text, is available in the same way. The history of what human beings have placed into those silences is a history of what those human beings most feared and most desired and most needed to believe about the people around them. Reading that history does not require abandoning the tradition that produced the silences. It requires taking the tradition seriously enough to distinguish between what the text actually says and what specific historical communities needed it to say, and to hold that distinction with the kind of care that the text itself, in its most honest moments, models. The tablets in London and Philadelphia and Berlin do not provide a cleaner version of the story. They provide an older one. And older is not the same as better. The Sumerian version's generosity toward Enkidu is genuine, but it does not contain the Hebrew version's unflinching look at what the injury that generosity could not heal eventually became. What the tablets provide is context. The context that makes Cain comprehensible, not forgivable, but comprehensible as a figure who was produced by forces larger than his individual moral failure, who inherited a conflict he did not create, who was handed a wound by a divine rejection that the text never explains, and that 4,000 years of commentary has never satisfactorily accounted for. He was told that what he made was not enough. He was not told why. He was not given the opportunity that Enkidu was given to hear the case for the other side, to understand the preference as something other than a personal condemnation, to stand in the same landscape as his rival without the need to destroy him. He was just told no, and the question of what we do with the no's that the world gives us, the unexplained rejections, the preferences we did not receive, the offerings that the smoke carried upward and then returned, is a question that has not been answered by anything that has happened in the 4,000 years since someone pressed the oldest version of this conflict into wet clay in a school in ancient Sumer. The tablets know the older story. The jar knew the hidden story. And the story that never ended is the one we are still inside, the one where two people stand in a field with their offerings and wait to hear which one the world has decided to value. That moment has not passed. It is happening right now, somewhere, in every language, on every continent, in every conflict between a way of life that was preferred and a way of life that was not. The first murder in the Bible was not the first time anyone told this story. It was just the version that survived.